Hi, my name is Joshua Ralston. I'm a lecturer in Muslim-Christian relations here at the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. While I'm based in Scotland, I'm clearly an American, and my research primarily focuses on Christian and Muslim theological debates around issues of law, politics, ethics. I've been here in Scotland for a little over 2 years now, having previously lived both in Egypt and in Palestine. So as an academic, I began to get interested in Islam partly through friendships that I had in the States with Muslims from the northern part of Sudan and from Egypt. And as that academic interest developed, I became much more interested in the broader Islamic tradition. And so as a scholar, I think I have a particular unique angle on Islam, particularly one that probably exceeds some of the popular assumptions or popular questions. I think one of the benefits that I've experienced having lived in the Middle East for a number of years is having a perspective on Islam and on Muslims as a lived religion, not just as an idea, right? So you see the rhythm and the order and the beauty of the way of life that many Muslims have, the reverence they have for the Prophet, the way in which the Quran is not just a book, but infuses all of life with its beauty. In terms of Shiism in particular, having lived in Egypt and Palestine, there's a much smaller number of Shiis, although maybe there's more than you know. And so my knowledge of the Shia tradition is much smaller than my knowledge of the Sunni tradition. However, as I've begun to teach Introduction to Islam and get more in depth in the history of the Shia tradition, some of its practices, it's really broadened out and expanded my understanding, particularly around the ways in which they conceive of the place of the Prophet's family, of Ali, of Hassan and Hussein, and in the way in which that continues to be a driving force in the moral and spiritual practice of Shias. I think, like many people, you come across the idea of Ashura and the ways in which Shias remember and mourn that day before you actually come across Hussein. So I think my first inclination, my first entry point to what this was through news or documentaries as a teenager probably, in seeing the ways in which the Battle of Karbala was remembered and practiced. Often, as often happens in Western media, through some of the more controversial practices, some that have been disavowed by some parts of the Shia tradition. And yet that initial practice, which seemed quite odd to me, was also in some ways moving to say, what is it about this day? What is being remembered? And that led me to investigate a little bit more into who Hussein was and what was being memorialized. And the initial inclination after I got past some of my confusion about some of these practices was to be quite impressed with the conviction and the devotion of Hussein in the face of what seemed like insurmountable odds. What's interesting as a scholar of Christian-Muslim relations, as well as a Protestant theologian myself who engages in Christian-Muslim dialogue, Hussein is never usually one of the major figures in these dialogues, in the debates. Often you might have discussions, for instance, of Jesus or of the prophethood of Muhammad. Hussein doesn't figure very often. There's been some interesting scholarship recently about Fatima, for instance, but not necessarily Hussein. And yet I think that's a missing element. There's possibilities for conversations around Hussein, about the model that he offers, about what he means for Shias, that could be a really expansive way to engage with Christian-Muslim dialogue and humanity more broadly, about some of the characteristics, some of the values that he held, not only as the grandson of the Prophet, but in the ways in which he thought of justice and standing up against tyranny. In terms of what the model of Hussein offers for the world, you might not think that this would be a compelling model at the moment, given the amount of religious rivalries, the ways in which attacks against Shias, against Christians, against other Sunnis by certain jihadi groups, that what we need is less martyrdom, not more. And yet I think the model of Hussein speaks to humanity more broadly about the need to stand up for justice in the face of oppression. Whether one has religious commitments or not, this is a model and it's something that is called for. The notion that suffering itself isn't something that we should valorize, but suffering in the way of justice and the way of God is something to be valorized. So I think he actually does in some ways offer a critique against certain models of religious martyrdom that value suffering just for suffering. What he is doing is trying to stand up for what he believes is right, to stand against what he perceives to be tyranny and oppression. And I think that's a model that speaks across religious devotion, especially as we see in the world increasing moves towards authoritarian governments. One of the biggest challenges facing interreligious dialogue or dialogue between secular people and religious people is the sort of mutual misunderstanding that people have of one another. Why is Muhammad important, for instance, for Muslims? Why is Ali important for both Sunnis and Shias? Why is Hussein important for both Sunnis and Shias? But often, whether it's between religious traditions or across religious traditions, we have a perception or a stereotype. And I think the ways in which we can maybe learn to inhabit another person's world it could help facilitate mutual understanding and growth. In terms of Hussein, I would say that outside of the Islamic traditions, there's very little known about him. And here is a model of a spiritual leader, of a religious leader, of a political leader, who actually, I think, could speak much more broadly to the world. It would be nice to include Hussein in the sort of pantheon of religious greats that often people talk about: Moses, Jesus, Buddha, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, these names that people regularly know. To include whether that's Muhammad, whether that's Fatima, whether that's Hussein himself, I think would help non-Muslims especially understand how the traditions of the early Muslims still continue to reverberate today and how they might speak to the world more broadly. The most obvious place to make a comparison between Hussein's martyrdom and Christianity is usually the death of Jesus. As you know, Christians and Muslims disagree about Jesus, both about his divinity, but also about his crucifixion, with the majority of the Muslim tradition saying that he didn't die, that he was rescued at the last minute. There's other Muslim traditions that say he may have died, but the word of God in him doesn't die. However, while there is a point of comparison between the death of Jesus and the death of Hussein, I'm not sure it's the best comparison for a number of reasons. Christians think of Jesus' death as not just sacrificial, but redemptive in a way that I don't think Muslims think of Hussein's death. It is a moment to be mourned. It's a moment that is to be remembered. It's a moment to be inhabited, but it doesn't have the same sort of redemptive significance of Jesus' death. In some ways, I think there's better examples in the latter part of Christian tradition of those who stood up for justice and yet were killed in the face of oppression. That may be a similar event, thinking, for instance, as an American, of the way in which Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for standing up for justice. Now, it doesn't work the same. Martin Luther King doesn't have the same place in the Christian tradition as Imam Hussain does. He doesn't have the same sort of moral purity in our eyes. But there is some points of, I think there's ways in which, especially in Christian theology, what's called liberation theology, may have points of dialogue and engagement with Hussein. As someone who has deep respect for the Islamic tradition and the ways in which Islam inhabits a way of life, until recently I never really thought a lot about Hussein except for in my own teaching. But I think the model that he offers, in which suffering isn't chosen for suffering's sake, but it's endured for the sake of justice and for the sake of what is thought to be right, is a model that I think many people right now are trying to gesture for. That we don't suffer just because suffering is good, or we don't just die because we want to die, but if it comes back, if the choice is between honorably standing up for what we think is true and just in the world at a cost that even could be the cost of our life, versus acquiescing, compromising in the face of political injustice, that Hussein offers this model that I think is a compelling and needed one. Earlier I said that that maybe the model of Jesus and Hussein aren't the best examples. Now I'm going to backtrack. There's a famous story in the Christian tradition in which Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And if anyone's ever been to Jerusalem or Al-Quds, you know that the Garden of Gethsemane is towards the desert. You could easily escape the city. And he could see the lights coming down, and yet he chooses to stay. And one of his disciples, Peter, grabs a sword and is going to try to attack, and Jesus says to put down the sword. He allows himself to be arrested. I think there's a lot of differences between what Jesus does and what Hussein does. But at the same time, that Hussein had the option to flee from Karbala. He could have maybe found a way to Kufa, maybe gone back to Mecca or Medina. And yet he felt like, and he gave the people with him the option to leave, right? He didn't say, you need to die with me. It's all about me. But that he knew that he was facing what seemed to be insurmountable odds, and yet chose to confront injustice, to confront overwhelming power in the name of what he felt was the right, the haqq, to speak of a Quranic term. I think is a powerful moment and a message in the story. He could have easily compromised and signed the treaty with Yazid. He chose not to. He stuck with his commitments, and he stuck with those even when he knew that there was a cost. It's very difficult for a non-Muslim to sort of understand and inhabit the piety that people have towards Muhammad and the way in which he's important. Not that I don't value the Prophet, but I think for many people the Prophet is so distant and it's so hard to get a grasp on as a Christian or as a non-Muslim. And I think Hussein in many ways is an example of a sort of a moral, political, spiritual person from the Muslim tradition that's more relatable for non-Muslims many times than the Prophet is. I actually through this interview have been thinking a lot more about the possibility of Hussein as a point of interreligious dialogue. And what's fascinating about Hussein and the possibilities that he might bring to these kinds of constructive engagements is that one need not affirm, in the ways that Shias affirm, his place in the imamate, to respect and to engage with his thinking. Now, of course, there'll be disagreements between Shias and Christians, or between Sunnis and Shias about Hussein. But one of the really fascinating points about him is that he's this figure that is actually revered by both Sunnis and Shias. There's obviously other figures around the event that there's deep disagreements about. Aisha, Fatima, Muawiyah, although I don't think anyone's a huge Muawiyah fan, Yazid. But I think for both Sunnis and Shias, there's this sense in which the Battle of Karbala is a tragic moment in the early Islamic tradition. It's a marker of a split that was beginning to burgeon that now went seemingly irreconcilably apart. And yet Hussein himself is thought of highly in both traditions. He's remembered in different ways, of course. And I think that possibility could be extended outward into dialogue with Christians around similar figures in the Christian tradition, as well as with the Jewish tradition, who have their own biblical stories of those who stand up against insurmountable odds. I think, I don't know if it's in the Quran, I don't think it is, the story of Gideon, who is an early judge who has only 300 men and faces these 10,000 Midianites, or Joshua or Moses, also figures in the Quran who are thought of as prophets. And there's ways in which I think we might think of interreligious dialogue not always focusing on the issues that continually confound us, the Prophet of Muhammad, the place of the Quran, Jesus, the Trinity, but might actually think of Hussein as a place that we could come together and have discussions, partly because it would allow us to talk about some of these what we would call religious or spiritual issues, but it also allows us to talk about ethics and political issues. What does it mean to stand up for justice? What does it mean to struggle for dignity? How do we maintain a community that's marked not just by power, but by dignity, justice, and truth?